At exactly 7:30 hours, on November 1st, 1943, Lieutenant General Alexander Vandegrift stood firm on the bridge of the command vessel USS Macaulay, watching the shadowed outline of Bougainville emerge slowly from the cold morning haze. In just 2 hours, nearly 14,000 Marines of the 3rd Marine Division would surge toward the shoreline of Empress Augusta Bay, the opening stroke of a campaign that could reshape the war in the Pacific. To the northwest, some 250 miles away, the Japanese held 110,000 troops entrenched at Rabaul. Those troops existed for one purpose: to stop exactly what Vandegrift was about to do. Yet, they were not moving. Vandegrift understood why. He had commanded Marines through the nightmare of Guadalcanal. He knew the cost of striking a fortified Japanese defense. You bled, and you bled heavily. The hellish island fighting across the Solomons had already taken thousands of men over objectives so tiny they barely appeared on wartime maps. And in only 3 more weeks, Tarawa would repeat the same brutal lesson. More than 3,000 casualties for a patch of land just 2 miles long. But Rabaul was not 2 miles long. Rabaul was a fortress, a sprawling, hardened citadel that made Tarawa look like a routine drill. The Japanese had spent 20 relentless months turning Rabaul into the most fortified stronghold in the entire South Pacific. After capturing it from a small Australian garrison in February 1942, they transformed the base into what was essentially an unsinkable floating airfield. Inside Simpson Harbor, room existed for 100 ships. 5 major air bases encircled the harbor like iron rings. Lakunai and Vunakanau, former Australian runways, had been rebuilt with long concrete strips. Rapopo opened. December 1942 sat 14 miles southeast of town. Tobara, completed August 1943, lay between Vunakanau and Rapopo. Karavat, positioned along the north coast, completed the deadly network. Together, these airfields held revetments for over 400 aircraft and runways strong enough to handle Japan's heaviest bombers. A shield of 367 anti-aircraft guns covered every approach route. 43 coastal guns guarded the beaches. More than 6,000 machine guns were dug into pillboxes and fortified bunkers. Below the surface, the Japanese army had carved hundreds of miles of tunnels into the volcanic stone, creating underground barracks for 20,000 troops, field hospitals capable of treating thousands, vast ammunition depots, and command centers buried so deep that no Allied bomb could ever reach them. By mid-1943, over 110,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen were entrenched at Rabaul. Rabaul was the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific. Ever since Guadalcanal, the Allied master plan had centered around one objective: seize Rabaul. General Douglas MacArthur called it the key to the entire theater. Admiral King made it the prime objective for 1943. Operation Cartwheel had been approved specifically to isolate and capture Rabaul by March 1944. But planners studying the intelligence saw an unavoidable truth. Taking Rabaul would cost more American lives than any battle since the Civil War. The Japanese had learned from Guadalcanal and from every island battle of 1942. They knew the Americans would arrive with naval gunfire, with heavy bombers, with armored transports. They knew Marines would secure beachheads, so they built defenses designed to twist those advantages into deadly liabilities. Deep tunnel systems made strategic bombing almost pointless. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns meant close air support would be suicidal to deliver. And the massive garrison meant the Allies would struggle to achieve numerical superiority without stripping forces from every other front. Rabaul's geography offered only 3 landing zones, all narrow, all covered by interlocking fields of fire, prepared over 18 months by engineers who knew exactly how to kill an invasion force. Allied intelligence estimated casualties of 30% for any direct amphibious assault. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison would later write that Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would have looked pale pink compared to the bloodshed that a direct assault on Rabaul would have unleashed. But even in mid-1943, before the later Pacific battles had unfolded, Allied planners calculated that 60,000 assault troops would suffer 18,000 dead or wounded in the first phase alone, and those grim estimates assumed everything went right. They did not account for Japanese reinforcements from Truk, or disastrous weather, or failed naval bombardments. There had to be another way. The first American commander to die attacking Rabaul was Brigadier General Kenneth Walker, leader of the 5th Air Force Bombardment Command under General George Kenny. Walker was 44, a strategist who believed that air power alone could win a war. He had taught at the Air Corps Tactical School. Written doctrine. And spent years arguing that strategic bombing, properly applied, could destroy any target on Earth. Rabaul became his test case. Walker flew his first mission over the base in September 1942. The raid accomplished nothing. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire forced the bombers back before they could inflict real damage. But Walker believed in persistence. Hit them again. Hit them harder. Destroy aircraft on the ground. Sink ships in the harbor. Crater the runways. And eventually, the base would suffocate. On January 5, 1943, Walker led a daylight raid on Simpson Harbor with 6 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 6 B-24 Liberators. General Kenny had ordered a dawn strike to avoid enemy fighters. But Walker delayed until noon, arguing his bombers needed daylight to form up properly. 12 bombers flew straight into the most heavily defended target in the Pacific. At high noon, the Japanese were ready. Fighters from 3 airfields scrambled to intercept. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire in dense waves. Walker's B-17, tail number 41-24458, nicknamed San Antonio Rose, was hit almost immediately. But he continued forward, leading the formation directly into the storm of fire. His bombardier scored direct hits on Japanese vessels. Then, nearly 15 enemy fighters attacked. San Antonio Rose, already damaged and trailing smoke, could not evade. 4 or 5 Zeros closed in on the lead plane. Observers watched the bomber descend, losing altitude, sinking into the clouds, with smoke pouring from the number 3 engine. It vanished. Walker, his crew of 10, and the aircraft were never found. Walker received the Medal of Honor posthumously. President Roosevelt presented it to Walker's son on March the 25th, 1943. But the raid had failed, the Japanese convoy escaped, and strategic bombing had not, and could not, neutralize Rabaul. Walker remains the highest-ranking American officer still listed as missing in action from World War II. The second major attempt came in October 1943. By then, Allied forces had secured airfields close enough for sustained bombing. General Kenny planned a massive strike for October 12th. A total of 349 aircraft, the largest coordinated raid ever launched in the Southwest Pacific, took flight. B-25 Mitchells, B-24 Liberators, P-38 Lightnings, Australian Beaufighters, every aircraft the Allies could muster. The raid hit all 5 airfields nearly simultaneously. Bombardiers reported devastating effects. After-action reports claimed over 100 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground. Multiple fuel depots ignited. Runways blasted beyond use. Congratulatory messages poured in. MacArthur declared Rabaul's air power neutralized. It was not true. Japanese engineers repaired the runways within 36 hours. Most fuel dumps had been empty. Critical supplies had already been moved underground. Allied pilots had overestimated aircraft losses. The Japanese had lost fewer than 20 planes, many of them already damaged and awaiting parts. The raid looked impressive in photos, but Rabaul remained fully operational. Kenny tried again on November 2nd. 72 B-25s and 80 P-38s attacked Simpson Harbor at extremely low altitude, a strafing and bombing run so dangerous that survivors later called it the fiercest air battle the 5th Air Force ever faced. One day earlier, the Japanese had reinforced Rabaul with 173 carrier aircraft, elite pilots from the carriers Zuikaku, Shikaku, and Zuiho. Those pilots were waiting. The American formation flew into a wall of fighters and anti-aircraft fire from both ships and shore positions. The B-25s flew so low their propellers kicked spray from the harbor water. 9 B-25s never made it back. 10 P-38s were shot down. Among the dead was Major Raymond H. Wilkins, commander of the 8th Bombardment Squadron. He had flown 86 missions. On his 87th, over Rabaul, he led his squadron through hell. His aircraft struck a destroyer and a 9,000-ton transport. Smoking and losing altitude, he could have turned for home. Instead, he dove on a heavy cruiser to draw fire away from his men. His plane crashed into the harbor. Wilkins received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The November 2nd raid cost 19 aircraft and more than 60 men. Japanese losses? 20 planes. Light damage to 2 cruisers. Rabaul remained untouched in any meaningful sense. By mid-November 1943, Allied commanders could see the truth plainly. Heavy losses, minimal success. Rabaul functioning as powerfully as ever. Strategic bombing had failed, not because the airmen lacked courage, but because Rabaul was simply too big, too fortified, too easily repaired. And the ground campaign offered no better prospects. American and Australian forces had been fighting up the New Guinea coast since January 1943. Every mile gained came at staggering cost. The jungle was worse than anything encountered in the Solomons. Dense rainforest, steep ridges, mosquitoes carrying malaria, swamps that swallowed men whole. Disease ravaged entire battalions. Malaria. Dengue fever reaching 104 degrees. Dysentery that left men unable to walk. Tropical ulcers that rotted flesh from the smallest cut. More soldiers were evacuated by disease than by enemy fire. At Buna and Gona, from November 1942 to January 1943, Australian and American troops fought 3 months to clear 2 tiny coastal villages held by 6,500 Japanese. The Allies committed 13,000 troops. Thousands became casualties. More than 7,000 Japanese died. Combat was brutal. Close range. Hand to hand. Bunkers made of coconut logs shrugged off .30 caliber rounds. Flamethrowers became the only reliable weapon. Bodies lay unburied for weeks in the heat. When Buna finally fell, commanders realized this was a new form of warfare. The Japanese did not retreat. They did not surrender. Every position had to be taken by force. If Buna cost 3,000 casualties for 2 villages, what would Rabaul cost? At Nassau Bay in late June 1943, American troops from the 41st Infantry Division landed to support Australian operations near Salamaua. The landing was supposed to be unopposed. Intelligence said the beaches were clear. It was wrong. Japanese forces resisted fiercely. The Americans landed but spent weeks fighting through swamp and jungle to link with Australian units. What planners thought would take days took 6 weeks. And casualties mounted, not from major battles, but from constant skirmishes, ambushes, snipers, and disease. Then came Leh, September 1943. MacArthur's most ambitious operation yet. The 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment jumped onto Nadzab Airfield while the Australian 9th Division landed amphibiously at Leh. The assault worked. MacArthur himself watched from the open doorway of a B-17 bomber. The airfield was captured, but the Japanese 51st Division refused to collapse. They retreated into the mountains, fighting all the way toward Finschhafen. 2 weeks cost the Australians over 400 casualties. More than 2,000 Japanese died. but thousands more escaped to fight again. The pattern repeated everywhere. Finschhafen fell in October. The Huon Peninsula was cleared by January 1944. But Japanese forces retreated in good order each time, falling back toward Rabaul, where 110,000 men waited in the strongest position in the Pacific. The math simply did not work. If capturing one small village cost 3,000 casualties over 3 months, and securing a single airfield cost 400 casualties over 2 weeks, then assaulting Rabaul, with 5 airfields, massive troop strength, and hardened defenses, would cost more lives than any campaign the Allies had ever endured. Something had to change. The idea that ultimately transformed the war did not come from one brilliant officer working late into the night. It stemmed from decades of evolving strategic thought. Back in 1921, Marine Corps Major Earl Hancock Ellis had written War Plan 712, Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. His concept proposed that the United States could defeat Japan by capturing key islands while bypassing others, isolating enemy garrisons by dominating the sea. Admiral Raymond Spruance Rogers refined similar ideas in the 1911 War Plan Orange. Though these were theoretical for a future war, no one thought real. Fast forward to June 1943. As Allied forces fought through the Solomons, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee in Washington began questioning whether capturing every Japanese base actually made sense. Their analysis was blunt. Assaulting Rabaul offered little chance of reasonable success. If American forces could dominate the sea and air around the base, then Rabaul itself didn't need to be captured. It only needed to be neutralized. The strongest advocate for bypassing Rabaul was General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. Marshall, age 62 in 1943, viewed the Pacific War through logistics, through casualty ratios, through cold, unforgiving mathematics. Every division sent to the Pacific was a division not preparing for the invasion of France. Every ship used in the Solomons was a ship not carrying supplies across the Atlantic. Marshall ran the numbers. A direct assault on Rabaul would need at least 60,000 assault troops, probably 75,000 with support units. Casualties in the first 2 weeks would reach 20,000 to 30,000. Replacements would take months, training even longer. And worst of all, even if captured, Rabaul offered no strategic value beyond denying it to Japan, a goal that could be achieved without invasion. Marshall presented this logic to the Joint Strategic Survey Committee in June 1943. They agreed. Their recommendation was simple: do not attack Rabaul. Isolate it, neutralize it, bypass it. But recommendations were not policy, and many senior officers still believed that major enemy positions had to be taken head-on, not bypassed. Their thinking was about to be tested. Lockwood fought the Bureau of Ordnance at every turn. He ran unauthorized tests when the Bureau refused. He meticulously documented every torpedo failure. He collected patrol reports from dozens of submarine commanders, all describing torpedo malfunctions. He compiled statistics showing American submarines were firing 10 torpedoes for every confirmed sinking. That ratio should have been 3 to 1 at most. The problem wasn't the commanders, it was the weapons. Lockwood empowered his submarine commanders. He gave them permission to modify torpedoes. When official changes were delayed, some submarines disabled magnetic exploders on their own initiative, breaking regulations because they knew the devices didn't work. Lockwood covered for them. He didn't court-martial anyone. In early 1943, he flew to Washington to confront Bureau officials directly. He walked into a room of senior officers, many of whom had designed the Mark 14, and did not want to admit it was flawed. Lockwood presented his evidence, test results, patrol reports, statistics. He demonstrated the magnetic exploder was unreliable. He proved submarines were hitting targets without sinking them. The Bureau officers were defensive. They claimed commanders mishandled torpedoes. They suggested magnetic exploders were damaged by rough handling. They offered every excuse, except that their design was flawed. Lockwood lost his temper. If the Bureau of Ordnance cannot provide torpedoes that hit and explode, or a gun larger than a pea shooter, then for God's sake, get the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook to rip the plates off a target's side. The room went silent. Nobody spoke to the Bureau that way. But Lockwood didn't care about protocol. He cared about his submariners. He was sending men to war with defective weapons, and the bureaucrats who designed them cared more about covering their mistakes than fixing them. Lockwood made it clear. He wouldn't leave Washington until action was taken. He had Admiral Nimitz's support. He had proof. And he wasn't backing down. Lockwood also made another critical move. He relieved submarine commanders who were not aggressive enough. In the war's first year, many skippers were cautious, following pre-war doctrine, emphasizing risk avoidance. They would make one attack, fire torpedoes, then retreat. Lockwood demanded aggressive action. His philosophy: take calculated risks, push the attack, fire when the target is most vulnerable. It was a shift from timid tactics to decisive strikes. As torpedo reliability improved, American submarines transformed into lethal weapons. They started controlling the sea lanes, cutting Japanese supply lines, strangling Japan's economy with precision and persistence. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines, despite technical excellence, accomplished almost nothing. They had working torpedoes, advanced submarines, but strategic mistakes rendered their efforts irrelevant. The first American submarine commanders to experience these failures had been on edge for months. Every patrol carried uncertainty. Every torpedo fired was a gamble. Yet under Lockwood, the tide turned. Tests corrected depth settings. Magnetic triggers were deactivated. Contact triggers were redesigned. Confidence returned to submarine crews. Patrol after patrol, targets sank. Japanese merchant shipping was destroyed in record numbers. The once impotent U.S. submarine force became the silent killer of the Pacific. The difference was leadership, evidence, action. Lockwood's insistence that men be equipped with functional weapons saved lives and accelerated Japan's defeat. By late 1943, the American submarine campaign was irreversible. Japanese logistics crumbled. Critical supplies never reached islands or garrisons. Fuel, food, ammunition, all lost at sea. American torpedo reliability now allowed precision attacks. Commanders executed attacks with doctrine perfected. 90-degree shots, optimal range, maximum effect. Ships once impervious to damage now sunk in single torpedo strikes. The statistical evidence was clear. Before the fixes, 10 torpedoes per sinking. After modifications, efficiency improved dramatically. The weapon was no longer the weak link. Submarine crews could trust their tools. Lockwood's actions established a precedent. Testing in the field, challenging authority, defending crews, all became lessons for modern naval operations. He prioritized operational success and sailor safety over bureaucracy. American submarines, once hindered by flawed weapons, were now a decisive force. Every patrol carried lethal potential. Every strike mattered. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. The story of the Mark 14 torpedo is a story of failure, persistence, and ultimate triumph. 21 months of flawed weapons, hundreds of American lives lost, thousands of Japanese ships spared, could have been avoided with timely action. Lockwood's leadership changed history. He defied protocol, defied bureaucracy, tested the weapons himself, and protected his crews from punishment. By November 1943, the torpedo issues were fixed, depth control corrected, magnetic triggers disabled, contact triggers redesigned. American submarines now had reliable torpedoes. The silent service became the decisive edge in the Pacific. Ships sank with precision. Japanese supply lines were destroyed. And the submarine campaign became, according to Japanese testimony, the single greatest factor in their defeat. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines, despite technical excellence, failed to impact the war's outcome. Strategic errors rendered their tools ineffective. The Mark 14 saga is not only a tale of engineering failure, but of leadership, courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth in the unforgiving expanse of the Pacific War.